the man who helped free India from British rule.
I was born in Porbandar, a city on the west coast of India where most people lived in poverty and hardship. We were lucky. My father was the chief minister of the city, so we had a decent standard of living. My mother was a true follower of Jainism, an Indian religion that believed, among other things, in complete self-control. This meant that although we were not poor, our lifestyle was a simple one. India was under the rule of the British Raj, and many white men from the British Isles were sent to our country. They forced their law on us, but could not change our customs and beliefs. People who believed in Jainism thought that differences between people should be solved with respect, mutual tolerance, and understanding, not violence. I followed these principles faithfully my entire life. I was married at the age of 13 to a girl a year older than me who was called Kasturba. As was the custom, it was an arranged marriage with neither of us having any say in the matter. Over the years, we had 4 sons, although our first child, born 2 years into our marriage, died just a few days after birth. Medical facilities were limited and basic, and many babies and children died as a result. I was fortunate enough to have a good education, and I decided that I wanted to study law. I had heard a great deal about all the fine cities in Britain, and the place I wanted to go was London, which I had heard was the greatest of them all. So, having gained a place at University College London, I left India. It was a complete culture shock to arrive in such a big city after living my whole life in Porbandar. I was used to the heat of India, and the cold and never-ending damp of England was not a pleasant experience for me. I no longer kicked up dust on the roads of my hometown. In London, you were more likely to be covered in mud than dust. Before, I had been just one of many. Now I was one of the few, an Indian man amongst the British. I was a long way from home, and each day was a challenge. I spent many lonely days studying my law books. Law to me was not just about what was legally right or wrong. I also wanted it to help people behave in a way that was socially acceptable, and this meant looking at the principles behind the law. My early life in Porbandar influenced me greatly, as the Jainist principles I had brought with me guided me both in my studies and my social life. One of the battles everyone has to face is how to beat their own inner enemies, such as anger, intolerance, and immorality. I believed that self-control was important, and that taking responsibility for your own actions was essential. It was no use blaming someone else for your own bad behavior or lack of willpower. Where I came from, these beliefs guided poor and rich alike, but in London, I found many different views. It was not Jainism that was being debated, but capitalism and communism, or democracy and theocracy, and I found it fascinating to be exposed to so many new ideas. However, no matter what I heard, I held strongly to my beliefs and managed to resist all the temptations facing a young man in the city. In 1891, I graduated from university and was called to the bar. I thought it was a strange expression, as if one was going to be served drinks, but in reality, it meant that I had become a qualified barrister and could now represent people in the law courts. 2 days after my graduation, on the 12th of June 1891, I set sail for India. On arriving, instead of the joy I had been expecting at coming home, I was told my mother had died. Days of sadness were followed by hard times financially as I tried to care for my family. I set up a law practice in Mumbai, but the lack of clients meant that I soon had to close it down. I decided to apply for a job as a school teacher, but I was unlucky there too, and my application was rejected. In 1893, I accepted a 1-year contract in the British colony of Natal in South Africa. It was a relief to have some paid work, but frustration took its place as I experienced countless acts of discrimination. This is one example. One day I was traveling, quite legally, in the first-class carriage of a train, when I was told by a guard to go and sit in third class. When I refused to move, I was actually thrown off the train. My Jainist beliefs of tolerance for all people told me that action against prejudice was required. Realizing that the law was not enough to protect one's rights, I knew I had to do something myself. I decided to stay and campaign for civil rights for minority groups. The Natal Indian Congress was formed in 1894, providing the Indian community with a voice. I persuaded my family to join me in South Africa. But life there was not easy for us. I had seen poverty, injustice, and suffering, and my lifelong aim was to bring about peace and prosperity all over the world. However, in South Africa, it seemed a very long way away. For example, Indian marriages had been declared illegal. In 1908, I was arrested for leading resistance and spent 2 months in prison, which strengthened my determination to stand up for my beliefs. On the streets, prejudice against Indians remained. In 1913, I led 2,500 Indians in a protest, and once again, I was arrested and put in prison. In Europe, the First World War had begun, with more violence and destruction than had ever been seen before. I was worried that such a conflict could happen in India. I wanted to help our nation develop in a peaceful way, which I called ahimsa. But I didn't know what role I could play. South Africa was burning with racial conflict. We had children born in a country where Indians, an Asian minority, were always seen as immigrants. However, the Indian population was caught in the middle of a larger battle, the tribal groups fighting against the British and Dutch settlers. I wondered if I should be using my talents in my own country. After 21 years in South Africa, it was time to return to India. Aged 45, I took my family home. In India, we had the same issues of prejudice. Indians were subservient to the British, and we were a divided nation under the Raj. We were also divided between Hindus, Muslims, and other religions. My family and followers needed support, and so I set up a farm, a place for them to go, called Sabarmati Ashram. I believed that Indians, not the British, should rule India, and my political campaign for independence began when I spoke at the Indian National Congress. The turning point in my campaign happened when I visited a place called Champaran. Here, my goal was to help poor farm workers working for British landlords. The British ordered me to leave, but I refused and told the workers to hold non-violent protests. I was arrested. Hundreds of thousands of people marched in mass protests, and eventually the law was changed, giving the farm workers more control. The Satyagraha, non-violent approach had worked. News of the success spread through cities, towns, and villages, but the prejudice and violence did not stop. In 1919, in Amritsar, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. 379 people were murdered and over 1,000 wounded, and I realized that self-government for India was essential. By 1920, I was the president of the All India Home Rule League, and our cry was independence from the British Empire. In 1921, the Swadeshi policy was introduced, where we decided not to buy foreign goods, particularly cloth from Britain. Other protests were organized to raise political awareness, but it was a long, slow, and difficult process. Those in power were reluctant to admit defeat. Month after month, I traveled across India, encouraging people to protest. I was arrested and put in prison for 2 years for trying to make people disobey the government. No prison is pleasant, but the conditions there were truly terrible. Despite this, they could not break my spirit, and on my release, I became president of the Indian National Congress, the INC. Support for our cause was growing, and on the 30th of January 1930, I published the Declaration of Independence of India. I had not forgotten the bitter war that took place when the Americans made their own Declaration of Independence from Britain all those years before. I decided on non-violent action. On the 12th of March, I led a 385-kilometer march to the Gujarat coast in the west of the country. Here, I committed an act of defiance against the British, who had a monopoly of the salt production. I made salt from seawater. I was arrested for this crime, and immediately non-violent protests broke out across India, and thousands of Indians were imprisoned. News of this had spread across the world, and the leader of the British in India, Lord Irwin, wanted Satyagraha to end. I was released from prison, and I promised to give up the Satyagraha salt campaign on 3 conditions. The first was the release of those who had been imprisoned. The second was to allow Indians to make their own salt. The third was for the INC to be invited to the 1931 Round Table Talks in London, where the future of India was to be discussed. Irwin agreed, and on the 5th of March 1931, we signed the Gandhi-Irwin Agreement. I felt that the people of Britain needed to know more about our cause. While I was in England in 1931 attending the Round Table Talks, I was invited by the Davis family, who owned several mills, to meet the mill workers in the north of England. The mills were the factories that made cloth, and many mill workers had lost their jobs when India stopped buying British cloth. The Davies family wanted me to see the hardship that the now unemployed workers were experiencing. I understood their difficulties, and I tried to be sympathetic, but I wanted to make them understand how much worse living conditions were for the Indians. I hope I made an impression on them. In 1932, I started another major protest against British rule. This time it was on behalf of India's disadvantaged lowest caste, the Dalits, better known as the untouchables. I prefer to call them Harijans, God's children. The British rulers were planning a new political system that would increase discrimination against the Dalits and would damage Hindu society. To gain attention, I refused to eat. To no one's surprise, I was again thrown into prison. Although I was furious, I kept to my principle of non-violence, and I still refused to eat. After 6 days of fasting, it was agreed that the new system would not be introduced, and it seemed that our non-violent protest was again having an effect. There was, however, still much to protest about, and I spoke at many meetings. The British officials objected, and they arrested me again. Had they learned nothing from the loss of their American colonies? How could such well-educated men act in such stupid ways? More long days were wasted in prison. As a lawyer, I knew the law, but what good did it do me? On my release, I was 63 years old, and it was time to travel. Over the next 4 years, I toured rural communities. The poverty was depressing, but the spirits of the people uplifted me and gave me new energy. However, far away there was more conflict as the Second World War had begun. As India was a British colony, it became involved in the war, with many fine men going into battle. My principles of non-violence were tested to the full. Could one be a pacifist when mass murder was being committed? If it had been Jains instead of Jews being gassed, could I have stood by? The reality of Nazism and the death camps made me think about pacifism. The major aim of the Indian National Congress was for India to be free of British rule, but we also wanted the country to remain united. For a long time, there had been violent racial conflict between Hindus and Muslims. The Muslims had their own organization, the Muslim League, which wanted India to be divided so that there could be an independent Muslim state. This was something that the British also supported. In 1942, I led a movement called Quit India, calling for immediate independence, and I was arrested. In the meantime, the Muslim League promised the British that the Indian army, whose soldiers were mainly Muslim, would continue to fight with them. This promise was on the understanding that two things would happen. Firstly, negotiations would begin for the British to leave India, and secondly, before they left, they would divide India to create an independent Muslim state. In the summer of 1947, Indian independence from the British was declared. This was on the day after the British created the Muslim state of Pakistan, dividing India. My wife did not live to see the independence of India as she died in 1944. I am sure she hadn't realized what marriage to me meant. At the age of 13, I did not know myself what I was going to do with my life. In truth, I was more married to the causes I was following than to her. But whether she knew it or not, her support kept me going. 4 years later, my spirit was also set free when I was assassinated at a prayer meeting. Ironically, it was not the British or the Pakistanis that fired the gun, both of whom had their reasons for killing me, but a Hindu nationalist.